Greetings, Heidi.
Greetings, Nana. I'm so happy to be here.
Very happy to have you here. You've been one of the people, and your organization's been one of the organizations that has been really pushing forward. Well, I don't want to say back, pushing forward on what we should be doing, which includes some kickback on what we should not be doing with respect to migration policy in this country, and particularly the topic that we're discussing now has been one that you and the org have been really instrumental in lifting up, which is what to do about folks that are coming to and through the southern border of the United States. So, as I indicated in my lead, we have the dueling border conversations. Literally, I could hear the whistle sound and see the tumbleweed. One one president on one side, the ex-president on the other side, two candidates pushing forward, but really representing not just these campaigns, right? But representing what has become the mainstream notions of what is happening at the border and how that should be addressed. I always try to start these conversations really talking to folks and having it be clearer to those who may not be clear about what barriers people already face, right? And so every time they talk about the border, it reminds me of that old racist film, Birth of a Nation, where they're just like teams of Negroes crawling over hills and walls to come and invade and take over and, rape white women and kill everybody. And that is the same sort of imagery that is being presented when it comes to the border, that just anyone can come. The border is porous, hundreds of thousands of people just walking through like an invading army. Help folks to understand what is really happening when this person decides that they are coming to the United States to claim asylum or some other form of relief, coming through the southern border. What are they facing?
They're facing like a gauntlet of re-traumatization, assuming that they probably have already fled a good amount of trauma in their life already. So I just, we can talk, I'll talk for a second about sort of the many, many obstacles that people face when they arrive. But I just want to note what you said about the imagery, because I think that the imagery and the rhetoric and this sort of moment we're in is so incredibly dangerous, because there was a president who decided to say things out loud that were previously kind of the behind the scenes conversations, the great replacement theory and use of terms like invasion to refer to people arriving at a border to seek safety and a better life. And what's more alarming than that happening to begin with is the next administration refusing to confront that is what happened, and refusing to start using terms that embrace humanity and compassion, right? And we know from a lot of studies about sort of dehumanizing rhetoric that what happens is when people hear this language and these images over and over again that refer to people as invasions, that refer to people as an invading army, that they start to actually become very supportive of policies that are harmful toward that population of people, because it becomes harder for them to have compassion and empathy towards a group of people they are being told is the other. So I just think that's the backdrop, and a really, really dangerous backdrop. And I will answer now your actual question, right? Which is, so the organization I work for, the National Immigrant Justice Center, our legal teams provide legal representation to people who have just arrived at the border and are trying to navigate this like very, very complex adjudication system for asylum in the United States. And as far back as at least I've been practicing law, which is for a long time, getting to the United States border and seeking asylum is itself its own challenge and trauma. And so many times I've had clients say to me something along the lines of, I never thought like I would make this incredibly hard decision to uproot my life and try to get myself to safety. And then when I finally got to the place that was supposed to be that opportunity for safety, I never thought I would then go through another round of things that I'm now recovering from, that set me up to have to recover from additional trauma. I've heard that from so many people. Um, and that's because the policy of the United States is what the administration and what the government calls a deterrent policy. Like the idea is to put policies in place at the border that are so intentionally cruel and harmful to people that in theory, the idea is that that will disincentivize people from trying to come. And of course, that's not true because people aren't choosing to flee because they read about the latest details of US border policy. They're choosing to flee because they have to for their ability to live. So there are a lot of obstacles currently in place when a person arrives at the southern border. The very first obstacle is just whether they're actually allowed to even tell an officer that they're afraid to return to their country. Expedited removal is this legal process that allows Border Patrol agents to just turn people very, very quickly back around and deport them if they don't express a fear of return. And this doesn't really get a lot of attention, but many people never have that moment to express fear because they're very afraid to do so to someone in a uniform after perhaps they fled harm from someone in a uniform. A lot of other reasons why.
And I just want to stop you there. We'll continue going through the obstacles to also add language access because we're hearing a lot about that from Black migrants who don't speak English, don't speak Spanish. Maybe what they speak is one of the 18 dialects of Mauritanian Kular. And, they're like, okay, we can't understand you. So that's it. Like they're not pulling up with some kind of interpreter to get that claim from you. They're just putting people on planes and returning people back to the places they fled. So I just want to add that layer, but go ahead. Thank you.
Language access is such a huge problem, right? And then the other thing that we hear from people is that there's this pressure to do this or like early processing in English or Spanish. And some people they may not be a native Spanish or English speaker, but like they picked up some Spanish along the journey. And if they're told pretty clearly by an officer, like, can you do this in Spanish, or you're maybe not going to get to do it at all, they're going to try to make their way through and then potentially answer questions wrong because they didn't properly understand the question. And so we have seen a lot of folks who fail their threshold asylum screening simply because they didn't really understand what was being asked of them because they didn't have access to the questions being asked in a language they understood. And there's not a lot of, I mean, to put it mildly, there's not a lot of interest from the government in trying to make sure that those languages are made accessible. So there's all the people who are simply turned back around and deported because they never got to express that fear. People who then make it past that first obstacle, some will be paroled and, what's called paroled, essentially granted temporary permission to enter the United States and go to their city of destination and start the asylum adjudication process, but other people will be detained. And have to go through a threshold asylum interview while they're either in Border Patrol or in Immigration and Customs Enforcement custody. And we could spend hours talking about how the opportunity to actually make your case for asylum while you're incarcerated becomes close to meaningless. I think anyone who's familiar with systems of incarceration can understand that. For people who aren't incarcerated, the Biden administration has put some new pilot programs in place that rush people through a very, very quick asylum screening process. And although they're not incarcerated, they're under surveillance. So they're often under ankle monitor e-carceration. I think I'll stop there. There's many other obstacles we could talk about, but the extent to which this explosion of the use of detention, which has been in place for so long, but now accompanied by hundreds of thousands of people under some form of surveillance or e-carceration, is becoming sort of de facto the way that the United States welcomes people seeking asylum, is by putting them in a system of incarceration. And that's in large part due to really successful lobbying by the private prison industry. So what does that mean?
Absolutely. I ask people, what would you expect if you were seeking asylum in another country? What would you want your process to be like? And I think for so many people, they can't imagine that. So many people in this country. So that's part of the issue, right? Is that you have so many people that think to themselves that the United States will always be a place that, man, may not be going the way you want to all the time, but will never be at a point in which people feel like they've got to get out of here. And so then I talk to people about just your individual sort of within country situation. Mm-hmm. How many people decide, or just because of economic reasons, we're not even talking about fleeing for your lives, that I can't live in LA anymore. It's too expensive, or I got laid off from my job, and now I don't want to have to go, but it doesn't make any sense for me to continue to be here if I have the opportunity to thrive, or at least make it, maybe even survive somewhere else. I'm going to take that opportunity. And what would you feel if what Heidi has just described is the process by which you get to move from LA to the Midwest or to the South because you've just decided it's cheaper in this other state, or there's an opportunity economically, which everyone thinks is normal. It is strange when people talk about how, well, some of these people are coming here not because they're seeking asylum, which is one issue, but because they're just, trying to do better than they are doing in their own country. And it's like, yeah, just like you might say, I'm moving to Ohio because that is a better place for me. And is that not logical that people are able to migrate for that reason? And should people who are seeking safety, running from economic terror, political terror, social terror, should they not be able to find themselves in a welcoming place when a country says that's who it is? And in the same way, if people are really just moving for economic reasons, should they not find themselves in a welcoming place? Should it be that therefore you must be ankle shackled, you must be hand shackled with somebody's surveillance watch, or you must be detained in a prison, which is what detention actually is? Those concepts of who is coming are a piece, I think, that help people to understand how they can find themselves maybe not fleeing this country, but leaving their own situation for similar reasons. And so help, talk through more with me who is coming, because according to the rhetoric, it's people delivering fentanyl, people who are going on college campuses and killing people who, like, this is basically who's coming in those teams across the walls.
Right. Yeah. This failure of empathy is like so central to what's going on, I think, with immigration policy in the United States right now. So I was thinking while you were talking, Anna, I was thinking back to a trip I made down to the border last year in 2023, and who were the people I happened to encounter, right? As I was spending some time in right along the border towns. And the population of people who are arriving at the US border is very, very different than it was 10 or 20 years ago. But it's been a while now, right? It's certainly been long enough that the US government should be able to have adjusted. Mostly what we're talking about is are people who are fleeing some sort of harm or violence. There are people, as you say, Nana, who are also looking for a way to better support their family economically. But I think it's also important to know, based on the people I spoke with, that that's much more sort of extreme in nature than I think you would understand it to be based on the way it's thrown around by politicians. I spoke to one family where the father had a very significant disability. And I should say, we're talking about a lot of families. I mean, if you walk through these, what are essentially camps on the Mexico side of the border, where people are sitting and waiting to try to get this appointment that they need through an online app to come in, it's a lot of families, a lot of moms with little kids. And this particular family, the dad had a significant disability. He had been the breadwinner for the family. And the fact that he was in and out of the hospital made it impossible for him to get a job because of discrimination in the country that he was from. And so you could say, sure, that he and his family came here to, quote unquote, seek an economic improvement for their family. But the alternative for them was straight up starvation, where they were fleeing. Other families told me stories of, the maximum wage that they were able to make being the equivalent of a few US dollars per month. So you can imagine trying to feed your family on a few dollars a month and then making the decision whether you were going to stay there or try to find a better way. And then a lot of people fleeing instability from political oppression, and people from all over the world, right? So we're, you mentioned this, Nana, people speaking so many different languages, people who manage to find a way to the southern border because there's supposed to be a right once you get there to say, yes, I am here to seek asylum, and that right is increasingly compromised. But that's just a snapshot. I also have really vivid memories of this recent trip of a mom I met who was an indigenous from an indigenous community in the country that she fled, and she was facing discrimination because of that. And she was there alone with her 4 children, all between the ages of like 1 and 12. And I don't know that I've ever met anyone more brave than a mom who makes that journey, right, with those 4 little kids. But she was there and she was waiting and had been waiting for months in very unsafe conditions just to be able to say, I'm here and I want to try to seek asylum.
That reminds me of the mom with a family that I met was from Angola, literally had from a 2-year-old to like a 16-year-old or something. And it was like her and her husband and 6 other kids in between,
Oh my
right?
God.
And the vivid memory I have is of her describing how terrible they felt as parents, having the older children witness the death and robberies and rapes and everything they witnessed crossing through the Darien Pass while holding the like eyes and ears of the younger children, so that at least maybe they wouldn't have to witness and be traumatized by that. That's a searing memory. Testified about that in front of the Subcommittee on Africa and Human Rights when Baji invited the CBC to the border. And then Congresswoman Karen Bass had a hearing right there, to an official hearing to be able to talk about what was happening with migrants at the border and Black migrants in particular. Thinking about who we're talking about it. And the reason I raise the range is because I think sometimes people think that, we are trying to hide, right, behind like the sad story of the person who is seeking asylum, right, based upon political basis or whatever. And I think it's important to surface that, first of all, there's all these intersections, as you've raised, that it's not something where a person just looks up and says, you know what, I heard that the United States fast food workers in California might be getting 15 an hour. Let's go. That is not what is happening. That there are other push factors that are contributing to people having to leave. And, that one of the pull factors is the United States saying, here, we are a country you can come to. I mean, this is the advertisement of the United States that you can come here. This is the land of migrants, this, that, and the other, while engaging in these deterrence policies, right? So sort of talking out of both sides of their mouths, on the one hand saying, don't come, and on the other hand saying, the US is the place you can come to, and we've signed on to these treaties. And so I think about what the push factors are, right? The fact that the United States huge corporations out of the United States are part of the push factor. The United States government and the way it interferes in people's governments and in people's countries are part of the push factors. Climate crisis, which most of the people are coming from countries that have a really small carbon footprint in comparison to the United States, right? But that climate crisis that results from what we're doing here in this territory impacts them to a much greater degree, and how that becomes part of the push factor. And the fact that the United States, for most of the countries of the global South, doesn't make it easy, doesn't have that many ways for people to come into the country. So it's like you already don't have many ways for people to quote unquote get in line, not a lot of lines. And then the legitimate line that's there, when people get in that line, then you turn it into some kind of Tough Mudder obstacle course when it's supposed to be a pathway, which, implies a nice space with flowers and garden. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, I mean, when you say that the mixed messaging, I think there's one of the great disappointments, I think, of this moment that we're in is like, where are the leaders? Where are the political leaders who are out there embracing that first part of the message? Like, yes, the United States is a country to which you can come and you can say, I am scared. I cannot survive where I was. Or I cannot thrive where I was, right? Please allow me to ask for a place here. And I think that it's just been this slow slog, since this administration began, of sort of our elected officials really coming to embrace the way that the Trump administration talked about it. And this gets back to the point about dehumanization and why people are losing that ability to have the empathy you're talking about, Nana. But I think this is a time with this Senate bill having collapsed because of former President Trump. To be clear, that's the reason why that bill collapsed, right? But with that bill having collapsed, with the State of the Union coming up, this is really a moment where you could see this administration stepping into that gap in messaging and saying, like, okay, look, this is a time for us to remember some shared values. Let's talk about what those shared values are. And you're asking about, what people refer to as lawful pathways, right? Which is that it does alleviate pressure on the southern border if there are more accessible ways for people either from their country of origin or from a neighboring country to try in advance to ask for advance permission to come to the United States. And a good example of that is the Uniting for Ukraine program that was set up, right? That I think our leadership was very proud of and was out there talking about and embracing and championing. And let's see a whole lot more of that. But with countries where the majority of people migrating are Black and brown immigrants, which is not the case with Uniting for Ukraine. And I think that I think that's obvious why we see the difference there, So there are some programs in place. There are programs that are similar to Uniting for Ukraine for people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. They are small programs. They need to be much bigger. And there needs to be a lot of attention paid to how hard it is right now for people who don't have access to resources and wealth to access those programs. And then, one thing that I've been reading a little bit more about recently is that you can't talk about the global displacement crisis that you're referencing, Nana, without talking about regularization or legalization, So if you look at Colombia, for example, which for a good span of time was welcoming and integrating millions of people from Venezuela. And there's been some pushback to the way they did that of late. But if you look to the success of their ability to do so, it hinged on one thing, which is that when people arrived, they got access to what the government, they're called, regularization. They got work authorization, and they got put pretty quickly on a path to be able to have the same benefits that all people in the country who were citizens were already entitled to, and to eventually get permanent lawful status and citizenship. That's the way to make it work. And there are mechanisms available to the administration right now, like designations and redesignations of temporary protected status, like other parole programs, that would really put people on a path to being able to integrate and thrive in their communities when they get here. And those pathways aren't available right now. And that's where the focus really ought to be.
Yes, thank you for hitting on United for Ukraine because that was exactly where I was going. See what happened when you walk with your comrades? They know exactly where we're gonna stop and get some water. Yeah, absolutely. Because that, I mean, that at Baja we talk about all the time that you know, Ukraine is the floor. United for Ukraine is the floor. That is what should be happening with everyone, right? In which it was like folks who were allegedly to be deported. There was a temporary, you know, a stop on deportation that they kept telling us, Heidi, could never happen. But mysteriously, they figured out how to say we won't deport this group of people from these countries. They gave TPS, the temporary protected status, to folks that were here already in the moment, right? And then created this program by which Ukrainians could come through the southern border. They literally, out here in California, where I am, they opened up a lane and put a red carpet on the ground so that they could walk in while it is under Title 42, when people couldn't allegedly just do that, while the rest of us, the Black and brown and Asian folks, were like looking, and Indigenous folks wishing we could do the same. And then they let people fly into airports, right? And that's not to say, oh, we're angry and they should be suffering behind the wall with us. That's to say, hey, everyone should be able to have this same kind of access. I think about when you're talking about regularization, two things. Number one, the ways in which, again, that program, United for Ukraine, allowed for a type of regularization. 20,000 Ukrainians were resettled in some form or fashion. And I'm using that term not necessarily technically, but were brought to, right? And you know, given a space to for housing and work permits and other things, 20,000 in Chicago. 20,000. Who is talking about them in this conversation that is turning into an inferno about new arrivals in Chicago? Like 20,000 Ukrainians arrived there without a peep, without a pushback, without a word. Not because people are even aware that it happened, but really because people aren't aware. The government so worked, right, between federal, state, and local to make sure that people were included into the society in a way in Chicago that people didn't even notice that 20,000 Ukrainians have shown up here, right, who don't speak English, by the way, right, have shown up here in our midst, and did the complete opposite when it comes to folks that are Black, brown, Indigenous, Asian, coming from other countries. No coordination, no effort. They're right in your face. They're sleeping in the cold in flip flops in the park next to the lake, you know, really, you know, having to beg for money because they can't work unless they work under the table. Like just a completely different way of moving, which speaks directly to your point. If you make a system that wants to include people, then people will be included and you won't have those tensions. If you have a system in which even the people that are from your country have been abandoned and not included in the society, then it becomes a lot easier to not include folks that are coming from outside who are also Black, brown, Asian, Indigenous, and therefore to create those kinds of tensions within abandoned communities. And I know, you know, that a lot of the work that you do is in Chicago, in Illinois, et cetera. And what have you seen? Am I mischaracterizing sort of what we've seen happening here?
No, I co-sign, all of that, Nana, as I always do when you and I are talking. And I think this point about tensions between already abandoned communities and newly arrived communities has obviously been so painful and so prevalent in Chicago. And one of the things that, going back to these studies that have been done on the efforts to welcome new arrivals from Venezuela and Colombia, is that these really sort of forward-leaning regularization of status programs in Colombia, what has been shown through that program is that there was a net gain to the economy for everyone, for new arrivals, and without any cost or downward salary results for people who were already there and already in the lower economic strata in Colombia. And that's what we could have here if we had the corresponding policies, right? So because that's the way the economy works. It's not a zero-sum game. It's when people are permitted to get work authorization and get a job and contribute to their neighborhood and contribute to the economy, then all boats can be lifted. But that isn't allowed to happen when you close off access to benefits, to work authorization, to community support for certain groups of new arrivals. And so that, I mean, that lesson, it's such a tragedy to see that playing out all over again. And then, that's when, in addition to the kinds of tensions that we're seeing in Chicago and many other cities too right now, but that's when the sort of conversation at the federal level about criminalization starts to happen as well, right? And we're starting to see again another sort of flurry of bills making their way through the House of Representatives that have this really awful demonizing rhetoric that paints immigrant communities as all people who are sort of prone to criminal activity. That's of course going to happen when you have this kind of rhetoric. That's just like how it works and how it has always worked in history. And it needs a forceful pushback from leadership that's really missing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a leveraging piece that we should talk about as abandoned communities, which is part of the work that, we're trying to do at Baji. It's like housing for all instead of prioritizing housing for new arrivals over housing for folks that are here already. Why don't we bind together and say, let's get housing? Because apparently you know how to create housing for 20,000 other people that have come in. So the possibilities are there, right? So let's see how we make that happen. I want to switch gears a little bit to this letter because I think, in the frenzy of this Senate bill that we've talked about on this show, that was, pushing forward such draconian deterrence. I call it the Gotham prison way of doing things, like the Joker, Penguin, like everyone, Two-Face, like everyone's vying to have the more horrible, diabolical plan, right?
Yeah.
That in that process, then it obviously helped with it push this negative narrative shift that we're talking about. Normally, at least they're trading off some kind of pathways to regularization for people. This time, they didn't even really have that, except for very few communities that were targeted there. And so there was a letter, again, pulled together by immigrant rights organizations, including NIJC, that was really trying to educate policymakers and urge and make some demands with respect to this bill. Can you talk to us about that letter and the ways in which people really signed on, got on board, and what the goal of the letter was?
Sure. So the letter, I think you're referring to the bill, and then there was another sort of equally important, I think, letter that happened right after the bill fell apart, which was in response to news reports that the administration was going to try to implement a lot of what was in the bill that had just failed through executive actions. Just a couple of things to flag about sort of letters that I think are coming from the advocacy space is that it is, to me, kind of sickening and so concerning the way that so much of what is happening in immigration policy is being covered by the press right now as a purely political issue. And so these conversations about, is the White House going to abandon or anger progressive groups by issuing these executive actions? And, what we're trying to say with these letters is like, the progressive groups, you can abandon them or not abandon them. This is about the people who are going to be impacted by the policies, a lot of whom are sitting in really dangerous conditions right now on the Mexico side of the US border, trying to understand if they will have an opportunity to ask for safety or not. And I think the extent to which immigration always has been a political football, right? But this particular moment feels so cynical. And the Republican and Democratic parties just both sort of tossing blame back and forth, that you even have, you have mainstream media outlets like analyzing sort of whether the American public can follow exactly the play that politicians are making about who's assigning blame for which pieces of. And, there are people at the heart of this policy whose lives are at risk, whose ability to thrive and lead full lives is at risk. And I just would love to see, some more, like you're doing, Nana, obviously, reporting that really just asks for kind of like a hold on this cynical political reporting. And so with these letters, I think it's a reminder that these policies impact people, that these policies also impact what is a very significant commitment the United States made years ago to remain in compliance with obligations under the International Refugee Convention, which is an important piece of international law that was written in the wake of tragic lessons learned from the Holocaust. And that moving forward with this bill and then moving forward with these executive actions would mark a significant departure from those commitments. The United States kind of walking away on the world stage from being a country that is part of the international community of states that's committed to refugee protection, welcoming asylum seekers. And what does that mean? And so these letters are trying to make sure that those conversations are happening.
And, it's interesting because this week there's going to be a congressional briefing on a push that Baji's also a part of to get the United States to set up like a human rights commission type of organization or entity that other governments have in other countries to be able to speak to the governments about their violations of human rights. The United States, surprisingly, doesn't have such a thing. You got to go talk to Blinken and them about what's happening. And we know that that's not leading us anywhere at this point between the DOJ and the State Department on these violations that are happening with respect to immigration policy. I hate for us to come to an end. Yeah, we got to do this again. But I do want to talk about what do you think people should be thinking about as they hear about immigration, or as they hear about what's happening at the border, as they hear this rhetoric that you've been talking about, the negative rhetoric that we know is going to be escalating and reach like really a fever pitch in November. You talked about this humanitarian piece. What should people have in their brain as they're analyzing whether or not what's being served to them is going to taste good?
It's not going to taste good. It's not going to taste good. So I guess I'll just highlight two things. One is that I would say that we all need to be taking reporting on polling with a grain of salt. Polling on immigration policy is different than other types of polling. I think that the answers that people give in polls, if you dig down into like the sort of detailed data on a lot of the polls that are being reported on right now, people answer very differently based on minor nuanced changes to the ways that questions are asked. And so it's very easy for polling for pollsters to kind of influence the outcome of a poll with very, very minor changes to questions, which is always true, of course, but seems to be much more true right now, given the complexity and how charged the immigration issue is. And then another thing I would say is, I think to the extent that sitting around like our tables with our families, and then with our neighbors and with community members and in our organizations, just to remember this point about sort of what it means for public perception of policy when certain communities are demonized or dehumanized in rhetoric by leaders. That we can't influence whether President Biden is going to continue saying that he wants to close the border, but we can influence the conversations we're having in our own communities, and remembering to look at immigration as a human rights issue and as an issue that is impacting all of us, as you know, we strive to have the kind of communities that we want to have. Just a last quick note, I read a fascinating study recently that looked at Google searches for people interested in trying to find out how to call ICE to try to have someone deported, and correlated those Google searches with increasing anti-immigrant rhetoric from elected officials in the United States, and found a direct correlation, right? So that's a lot for us in our communities to have to counteract. We have to get out there and counteract the anti-immigrant rhetoric with humanizing rhetoric and reminders that, you know, these are the communities we want. We want communities that are diverse and thriving and vibrant. So those are two things to flag.
Thank you so very much, Heidi. I really, really appreciate you joining me.
Yeah, I so appreciate you, Nana, and Baji's leadership. Always grateful.